Hello, everybody. I am Frances Flannery. This is Rodrigue Makalele. I'll let you unmute and say hello.
Hi, I'm Rodrigue Makelele, one of the co-founders of BioEarth.
Yes, and Rodrigue is also a founder of Vijana Africa, which is Swahili for Youth of Africa. So he wears two founder hats and two president hats. And so today we are really grateful because without exaggeration, this is an existential threat that we're very concerned about. As someone who has been an analyst on existential threat in terms of like terrorism and nuclear threat, et cetera, I do consider this an existential threat. So we're incredibly grateful to IRAS and to CJ Love, the president, for allowing us to present on this webinar. And I think we're just going to begin. But thank you, everybody, for making time to come to this. It means so much to us. And thank you again. So I do want to give a few disclaimers before I begin. And by the way, I don't know if Maynard Moore is going to pop in here at any time, but I'll keep going. Our presentation is divided into 4 parts. And I'm going to present on the first 2 parts. So Rodrigue is going to come in on part 3. So I don't want you to think that all this power has gone to my head and I'm just hogging the airspace, okay? Secondly, the slides have a lot of information on them, a lot more than we would normally pack on in PowerPoint, but that's because we are trying to raise awareness in a public campaign about this issue. So we want the sources of our information to be clear because some of you will want to do a deeper dive into this information. And so the third disclaimer is due to time. I won't go into the mechanics of climate change, which is such an important part of public education, but I'm assuming that a lot of you know this. And also I've presented on this before for IRAS. So there are webinars that you can look at the iras.org website, which will tell you about that. Now I'm going to set my own timer. Sorry, I'm trying to multitask here, which is not my forte. Alrighty, let me just look at the time here so that I'm sure that I know. Okay, so I can say that even though there are webinars where I've presented on climate change, the situation is worse now than even the last time I gave a webinar. So I do want to begin with a little bit of a climate change, sort of where are we at, before I explain to you why this is such an alarming development. Okay, so the news is much worse than it was before, even this summer or a few months ago. You probably know about the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which are the authoritative gold standard reports for climate change science. And hundreds of scientists internationally synthesize, I think for the last one, 34,000 climate reports. And the last one was issued in March of 2023. And the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, called it an atlas of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership. And I could not agree more. May I just pause and ask for, can everyone hear me all right? And I know you can't respond with sound, but Rodrigue, can you hear me all right?
I can hear perfectly fine.
Perfectly good. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. Okay, so I'm sure you've heard of the Paris Climate Accord in 2015 and the Glasgow Climate Pact. Thank you. I saw that thumbs up in 2021. And in these climate agreements, 196 nations met at UN-hosted COP, or Conference on Parties Climate Summit. Dan, we are going ahead and presenting, so I am going to mute you. Thank you. Okay, and then we can always pause later and get any introduction that you wanted to do. And so the 196 nations agreed to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. And this is measured since the late 1800s. And they agreed not to cross 1.5 degrees Celsius warming since that point by 2100. And the reason that this was the IPCC's recommendation at the time was because of tipping points. Tipping points become more likely. 6 become likely at 1.5. 4 to 10 of them become more likely at 2.0 Celsius. And this is a threshold that we should never cross because tipping points are, by definition, cataclysmic, widespread, abrupt, irreversible changes to regional climate systems that multiply, cascade, or trigger other tipping points. And so that means that one tipping point can trigger others, and they can speed the entire planetary climate system to higher warming much more quickly. So, so these tipping points are very important. And the sad news of this is that in March of 2023, the IPCC assessment report, AR6, told us that we're already at 1.5 degrees Celsius or just about there. And then the Copernicus Climate Service told us in June that we had been over that threshold for 12 consecutive months. So this means that these cascading tipping points are already starting to occur. For instance, the melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet, which could raise sea level by 6 to 7 feet, that's 2 meters by the end of the century, or up to 50 feet even by 2300. And again, these tipping point changes are irreversible, they're massive, and they can be civilizationally challenging impacts to the entire planetary system. The new goal that we are trying to set is much lower than it was before. We cannot avoid the catastrophic impacts that we wanted to avoid because even at 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, 1 billion people are currently facing water stress at least part of the year, and 2 billion will experience more flooding, fires will increase by 54%, et cetera, et cetera. And so these catastrophic impacts are unfolding. So the new goal is very sobering. It is a livable future. We're shooting now for a livable future for humankind by returning back down to the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold by 2100. The more we overshoot this threshold, which we are at now and overshooting now, and the longer we stay over it, the lower our chances are for reaching that goal. We need to reach that goal by reaching global net zero carbon emissions by 2050, which is not as far away as it seems as if you just stop and think about it. To get to 50% fewer global carbon emissions means, to get to zero, to get to 100% lower carbon emissions by 2050 means we have to get to 50% in about 5 years. 50%. We have to cut our emissions in half. And that means to get to this new goal, to secure a livable future, requires not only getting to global net zero carbon emissions by 2050, 25 years or so, but to get to net negative carbon emissions soon after. And that requires eliminating fossil fuel consumption completely, because anything else we put into the atmosphere is going to make this harder, and implementing carbon capture techniques and expanding the natural carbon capture technique of the environment, which is carbon sinks. These are ecosystems that absorb more carbon dioxide than they produce. That's why this is such a problem. The Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, is currently through 2024 auctioning 27 parcels for oil drilling in the Congo River Basin. They are approximately the size of the US state of Virginia. Okay, there were 30 parcels, but 3 have already been contracted for natural gas. but it's really the 27 parcels for oil drilling that are a concern. These occur in vital carbon sinks, the world's second largest rainforest, the world's largest peat wetland, and the construction of infrastructure alone is estimated to release the equivalency of 3 years worth of the entire globe's fossil fuel emissions. So if we are supposed to cut our fossil fuel emissions by half in 5 years, this is a very significant setback that could actually make it impossible for us to achieve that goal, because that's not even counting the future emissions from the oil that's being extracted. This ecosystem is very fragile and it absorbs 10 years of global emissions, and its destruction itself can be a climate tipping point. Not every ecologist has listed it as a climate tipping point, but some have. So I have put that study here. DRC is already the 12th most vulnerable country, it should say, to the impacts of climate change, and the 5th least capable of dealing with those impacts. But this terrible situation, not only, I mean, it's hard to believe that I'm saying, well, it could threaten, the existence of humankind and the planetary climate system. But in addition to that, it's very bad for the DRC. So the drilling itself risks poisoning. Let me just move everybody here out of this way here. It risks poisoning the water supply of 75 million people. It risks displacing 150 ethnic groups who call this area home. And this next piece was very stunning to me. As I was doing the ecological research on this, I found a study that was concluding that rainforests not only are important at this size to the planetary system, but they actually increase regional rainfall, which makes sense. It's through moisture recycling of photosynthesis and evapotranspiration. And that means that the destruction of the Congo rainforest would reduce rain all the way from the Horn of Africa to the Sahel. And of course, this area already suffers from drought. This also runs through protected areas of Virunga National Park, which my colleague will speak about, which is home to critically endangered species, but also in terms of DRC, because it will impact the planetary system and speed along warming, we have to remember that DRC is an equatorial country and it is an inland country, and they warm up to 2 times faster than even the rates that are projected, the very dire situation that's projected, which means that this could very well impact migration and result in mass migration of Congolese themselves. So we could just look at this in isolation, but what's important is to look at the roots. How did we get here? This did not occur in isolation. We want to look at it in terms of a much longer pattern of wealth extraction and resource extraction in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has happened repeatedly at the expense of ordinary Congolese. This has been called in the literature the resource curse, and this resource curse has occurred for 500 years, starting with slavery under the Portuguese, rubber under the Belgian king Leopold, after independence, the mining industries, diamonds, gold, also palm oil, and now cobalt and tantalum, which are critical to the green technology revolution. So I want to try to draw some of these threads together for everyone, because the underlying systems, underlying these systems are paradigms. I'm taking a systems analysis approach. The very famous systems analyst, Janella Meadows, spoke about any kind of system, an economic system, a political system, having an underlying mindset that is a paradigm that gives shape to the system. It shapes its goals, its structure, its rules, its delays, etc. And I want to suggest that there are 2 paradigms that are underlying this resource wealth extraction that has been going on for 500 years in the DRC. And the first is necroeconomics, literally death economics. Warren Montag coined this term to describe Adam Smith's justification of death as something that is just part of economic gain. But I found this in the work of a scholar, Anna Moore, who used it to describe the transatlantic slave trade. And she said, necroeconomics is an economic theory and practice that lets a population die to guarantee systematic profit. So we're using it to describe the religious, the economic, the political, and the social paradigm underlying these contemporary projects of wealth extraction, such as cobalt mining or the auction of the Congo River Basin for oil drilling. A second underlying paradigm that I'd like to explore is bad theology. Because the paradigm of necroeconomics, which devalues Congolese lives, Congolese bodies, Congolese welfare in favor of other bodies and lives, did not just occur in a vacuum. It occurred with the justification of biblical interpretations. As a biblical scholar, I'm saying this is bad theology, both because it is bad and destructive, but also because it's bad reading of the Bible. It ignores a lot. And I can't spend too long on this. I'm conscious of time. But ever since 1969, Lynn White Jr. has famously traced the roots of the environmental crisis to Christianity and the theology of human dominion over nature found in Genesis 1:28. However, lots of biblical scholars and eco-theologians have been working to show that that is possibly a mistranslation, and it ignores all kinds of other important ecological themes that are prevalent throughout Genesis and the whole Torah, or first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, because it was an ancient agricultural society. So they had this deep ecological intimacy. For instance, the word for humankind, Adam, is from Adamah, which is the ground. So we're literally dirtlings from the dirt. And then we are created in chapter 2 to till and tend the garden. And the word for till is the same as to serve. And I find this really meaningful because there's a Congolese tradition that Congo is the Garden of Eden. Trading in African slaves itself, which is the beginning of this resource curse of wealth extraction that we were talking about, and the devaluing of Congolese bodies and lives for profit, was first justified by a Catholic papal bull in 1452. But as it interpreted Deuteronomy 20 and 7, it ignored the historical setting of Israel and Canaan and just pasted Europeans onto Israel and Muslims, African Muslims, onto Canaan. But then that progressed to enslaving Black Africans by something called the Curse of Ham. Now, the Curse of Ham, which is prevalent among the Christian identity movement and a lot of the racist right in the United States, is something that maybe other parts of the world haven't heard of, but it's just as well because it doesn't exist. It's a very poor reading of Genesis 9 because God never made a curse there. Noah did, and it's meant to make Noah look bad. Ham was never cursed. Canaan was, which speaks to this rivalry that ancient Israel had with Canaan. And Ham was, anyways, not the ancestor of all Black people, as it's remembered. So that entire thing is bad theology. And I would also suggest that there are some unbiblical theologies that have been influential in Congo, influencing, and I can't draw a straight line, but influencing this system in which it makes sense to some officials to auction the Congo River Basin for profit. And that is that Neo-Pentecostalism has been very influential on President Tshisekedi. He has 3 Neo-Pentecostal pastors who are very close to him, even though he calls himself a child of Catholicism. And part of this theology is apocalyptic theology, that the world is ending soon. In fact, it's my friend Rodrigue who told me that all over Congo, there's a common thing that's preached on Sundays, that Congo is Noah's Ark. The end is coming, but the righteous in Congo will be saved. But this ignores so much, we don't even have time for it, because it ignores the Bible's stress on being a steward of the environment, of being put in charge of the garden, and the command to care for the poor as part of climate justice, which is in Matthew 25. But also part of Neo-Pentecostalism is the prosperity gospel, which says that God will reward those who are favored for a certain task with wealth, even if they gain it by corruption. This ignores Jesus's stress on caring for the poor in Matthew 25, the importance of social uplift in Luke 6. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are those who are hungry now. I cannot make these arguments because I am not an evangelical Christian, but this is starting to come out in literature, and this is Ngoy, Nelson Ngoy, in a great book here that is speaking from a Christian point of view as a Congolese Christian, arguing that this is not good theology. But another way that we got here has to do with the failure of the COP mechanism, the Conference on Party Meetings from the UN. And that is because theoretically it should work like this. The IPCC issues reports, the world's leaders gather at the UN COP meetings every single year. They get updated on these reports. They make their nationally defined contributions, and the Earth is saved. This has utterly failed. And the reason it has failed and emissions continue to rise is because in reality, this paradigm expects highly developed nations to lead negotiations on the model of the United Nations. And yet these are the ones that have benefited the most from fossil fuel emissions. And they are also the ones that will suffer the least harm from climate change. So it is actually the case that this thing that we're here to talk about, the auction of the Congo River Basin in an area the size of Virginia for oil drilling, was made possible by a letter of intent signed at COP26, presented by the Central Africa Forest Initiative, and the UK Prime Minister then, Boris Johnson, signed it. On behalf of CAFE, President Felix Tshisekedi signed it, and it was touted as this ambitious 10-year agreement to pour $500 million into Congo to protect the Congo Basin river forest or rainforest. However, it did not ban drilling in forest, peatlands, or protected areas. So as a new document that heralded the end of an era of protection, and having not established new bans on oil drilling, not even in protected areas, this is actually what opened up everything. How could this occur at a COP meeting? It could occur again because, as I was saying, inequity, but also oil interests permeate the COP process, okay? COP28, the latest one in Dubai, called for developed nations to continue to take the lead. But out of 196 attending nations, just 3 nations, China, the US, and India, produce 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. That means we have a disincentive to be radically transformative, to reach zero greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century, right? Just 3% of emissions are produced by 100 countries. And the United States is, in my opinion, probably the worst offender in that we have the greatest historical amount of CO2 emissions, and right now still the greatest per capita emissions. And yet in 2023, we produce more oil than any other country in history. We're not going in the right direction, and we're not even going to make the goal that's required to ensure a livable future for most of humanity. In addition, there was an unprecedented number of oil and gas developers who were allowed to lobby at the COP meeting. The president himself was part of an oil company who did not understand the role of fossil fuels. And now I'm going to turn it over to my co-founder, Rodrigue Makalele.
Thank you, friend. This is very, very deep and profound. And good afternoon again, everyone. It's a privilege for me to really co-present on this important topic with Francis, and also to support what Francis has been sharing earlier. I'll be focusing on the lived experience as someone that is from Congo. I'm originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo, born and grew up in Goma, Eastern Congo, what we call the region of multiple wars. Grew up in the war era and is still ongoing. And very recently, on Wednesday, which is yesterday or maybe Tuesday, 200 people were buried because of hunger or famine. And this is in one of the displacement camps. That is a result of a lot of war and injustices in the area, which is very connected to all these business deals that you've been hearing here. And really that is what is impacting the community, and that's what we call the necroeconomic paradigm, right? A system in which human lives is really expendable for profit. This is especially true in the DRC, where corruption, inequity, and poverty define the daily realities for millions. And corruption is endemic in the DRC. When I think about it every day, I'm like, it drains away resources, it perpetuates inequity, and leaves local communities impoverished. Despite the nation's wealth in natural resources, when you look at the poverty rates, they remain very alarmingly high. And this stark contrast is evidence of how a few elites benefit while majority suffer under a system that is already designed to exploit, but also impoverish its own population and its own people. And we will explore how this manifests today through both the oil industry, but also other forms of resource extraction. And if we, so, yeah, that's the right slide. So corruption in DRC has its roots in colonialism, particularly in exploitation of exploitative systems set up during that period. As we look at modern DRC, we see the continuation of these patterns, which have persisted post-independence. Today, the country ranks 166th out of 180 on the Global Corruption Index, which reflect the widespread mismanagement and lack of accountability within its own governance structures. So this deep-rooted corruption result in staggering losses. Around 50% of state revenues is lost every single day. Diverting funds from development projects in general to the pockets of corrupted officials. And without calling names, these are leaders and people in power that can negotiate business deals and contracts and can take money or resources from the Treasury Department or countries' resources and get in their pockets, as Francis said earlier today. So these are some of the inefficiencies that are coupled with the lack of transparency and which now become the biggest obstacle to sustainable growth and equitable distribution of resources in DRC. When you go to the next slide, I think that's the right one. So the Congo River Basin, so it's one of the world's most vital ecological zones, right? Which is currently at the center of this auction that Francis just mentioned. That not only threatens the environment, but also the people living in and around this area. Over 12 oil blocks, as Francis mentioned, being auctioned, right? They overlap with protected areas, including the Virunga National Park, which I will talk about later. But also you look at foreign corporate like French, British, Perenco, and Canadian 555 are basically the forefront of this exploitation. And despite the wealth generated from these resources, 73% of the population of Congo live on less than $1.90 a day. So, and in areas like the North Kivu, or around Virginia, 90% of the people live below that threshold. Communities face not only environmental degradation, but also displacement and destruction of their homes and agricultural lands. And families, especially kids, lose their homes and livelihoods while, trying to survive. And there's just a little bit of support that they get and sometimes do not get to try to relocate. And I talked about the catastrophic death of 200 people on that were buried on Tuesday. This is just an example of what is really happening, exacerbated lack of infrastructure, failures of government responsibility, but also the international community, which is seeing what is happening in the Congo. And when you go to the next slide, you're gonna see that when I look at the DRC struggles, and then I try to fit into the larger framework of global inequity and climate justice, the exploitation of African resources continue under foreign control, facilitated by global systems such as the COP mechanism that Francis mentioned earlier. The modern day slavery of cobalt mining, for example, is a prime example of what we're seeing today. The world relies on DRC's cobalt for green technology. 70% of global cobalt reserves are found in DRC. And as a Congolese person, I identify as a human rights activist, but also a witness of the horrific exploitation of over 40,000 children in cobalt mine. Which kids earn very little, maybe as little as $2 a day. That always devastates me. These children, some as young as 5 or 6-year-old, are forced into hard labor, denied the basic right to education, and are exposed to dangerous conditions daily. This is modern day slavery, and the world reliance on these resources is perpetuating this suffering. And I always say when we're in this space that like everybody wants to go green, but what is the cost for that? We need to ask ourselves every day. For me, as someone that has seen the impact firsthand, the knowledge that the children are toiling away instead of attending school is heartbreaking. Every child deserves the opportunity to learn, play, and grow safely, but these young lives are really stolen by exploitation and greed. It is impossible to stay silent while the lives and the futures of thousands of children are sacrificed for profit. That's for once. And then where there's war, millions of kids are displaced, losing everything that they know. So the climate impact on the DRC is profound, despite the fact that Congo really contributes very little to the global emission. But as Francis said, the country is warming twice as fast as the global average. So, and you see displacement, you see loss of biodiversity, you see destruction of communities that are becoming more frequent as climate change accelerates and driving, people away from their, homes and things that they know. But also this is driven by mismanagement of resource exploitation. The short-term profit enjoyed by a selected few come at the cost of the long-term survival of millions and the planet. And on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the Virunga National Park, where I worked for a little while when I was in Congo. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, right? It's under immediate threat due to the oil auction that we've been talking about. This park is home to more mammals, birds, and reptiles species than any other protected area on the planet. These include critical endangered species like western and eastern gorillas, bonobos, forest elephants, and the okapis, and so forth. The park is not just a haven for diversity, it also plays a crucial ecological role. Many species here are keystone species, such as the African elephant, which are responsible for dispersing seeds for 30% of trees in Central Africa. The loss of such species could have ripple effect, destabilizing the entire ecosystem. And we also have additionally like 3,000 plant species found in the DRC are unique to its rainforest, many with medical potentials that could best be lost forever if these ecosystems are destroyed. So in summary, what happens in the Congo doesn't stay in the Congo. The biodiversity and ecological stability of this region are essential to global environmental health. So we might we must prioritize, if I would say, the protection if we hope to combat climate change and ensure that a livable future for all is possible. I'm going to pass it back on to you, friend.
Thank you so much. I really look forward to the Q&A, and because I can talk about the research, but only Rodrigue can really speak about the lived experience, and he's got story after story after story. So I really look forward to the Q&A. So we've sketched something that's pretty scary and pretty terrible, that could result in mass migration, water scarcity, famine. We haven't even mentioned secondary causes caused by resource scarcity, such as militias. The oil infrastructure itself would be a big target of militias. And so it's a very terrible situation, and it's complicated. And the fact that it was facilitated by the COP meeting itself is even more cause for concern. So it may seem naive that we're saying that we're going to now suggest a path forward, but this is what the best that we've been able to come up with. We have a great team of 12 people at BioEarth, all wonderful minds thinking together, and I do have hope, despite the terrible story that we just told. Rodrigue, would you like to tell them about the 1 billion for Peace Pledge?
Yeah, the 1 billion for Peace Pledge is a really a global coalition or global movement, as we identified, of diverse individuals and organizations that really want to unite in a framework of sustainable peace in the commitment to this simple pledge: sustainable peace, which entails the physical, the material, the psychological, the cultural, religious, and the ecological well-being of all people. So in this, how we declare our intention to pursue sustainable peace in our work and our lives every single day.
This framework is so simple that you can name it on your hand, right? Physical, material, psychological, cultural/religious, ecological. But it is transformative because it is a different framework for peace than I've seen in securitized peace and in some of peace studies. So it's combining universal human needs with an ecological perspective and with peace building in order to speak about climate action. So there's, even though it looks deceptively simple, there's a lot of research that went behind this, right? And the idea as a theory was that this would be a peace movement that would be capable of growing and growing. And we thought religious networks would be key to this. We were hoping that other organizations and civil societies would be able to join. And this is based upon the work of Kim Dong-jin, especially, and Jean-Paul Lederach. And I will add that because I would like that in there. And they have worked in conflict zones to say global coalitions of diverse organizations can do all kinds of different things. And that was the idea behind this. So our hope, our theory of change when we first started in June of 2022, so 2 years ago or so, was that this movement would be able to amplify messages quickly and widely when something was urgent. And our theory of change motto was local plus local plus local equals global. That we don't all have to be working on the same thing. We just have to be coordinated. We just have to know that we're all part of this same commitment to sustainable peace. We knew that it could be a tool for public education about climate change, and we were hoping that it would mobilize climate action and connect diverse organizations to nurture new collaborations, facilitate resource sharing, idea sharing, so everyone isn't reinventing the wheel, right? And we at BioEarth were not thinking that we would lead all of this. We would just be the plus, we would be the connector, right? But one thing that we have purposefully cultivated is a sense of hope. The climate scenario is so grim. When something like this comes up, it's very easy just to throw up our hands and say, we can't do anything about it. But if we're together and we're all working on it together and we can see the progress, that can grow hope. We debuted this in 2022, 2 summers ago, when I was in Ireland, and I presented it with the Irish School of Ecumenics appropriately, and then at a benefit concert by Greg Brown at St. Patrick's Cathedral. And in the early days, we were just getting invitations and adding 1 person, 2 people, 5 people, 10 people, on and on and on and on. Although we were getting a lot of really cool invitations to universities, to secular and religious organizations. A highlight for me was when the Republic of Korea invited us to a peace conference there, a peace studies conference, and then also to participate in a roundtable in the DMZ on climate change and peace building. The U.S. Embassy in Lisbon has been very interested in our work and funded some travel for us to try to speak to people in Portugal, various conferences. But still, we were adding just a few, with a lot of legwork. And then came IRAS and PCUSA GA, which stands for Presbyterian Church of the United States General Assembly. Last year, I presented at IRAS on Star Island, New Hampshire. And if you have not come to a conference on Star Island, you absolutely should. I miss it right now. And this was at the annual conference, The Wizards of Climate Change, which was an odd name, but how can technology serve hope and justice? And the illustrious Reverend Jim Miller of PCUSA was in the audience. He took it back to Charleston Atlantic Presbytery, which became a signatory of the Peace Pledge, and wrote an overture for PCUSA General Assembly to adopt the pledge, which included instructions that then the Presbyterian Mission Agency would hold a consultation of PCUSA, PCA, now just reading, PCUSA related and other relevant parties to develop a comprehensive, coordinated, global long-term strategy to contribute to the mitigation of the consequences of climate change. And then they should report back in 1 year. 6 other presbyteries then concurred, and the overture went to the Standing Committee on the Environment and Climate Justice when I was at Star Island this summer. And the overture was passed in with a consensus vote in this document called a consensus at the 226th General Assembly of PCUSA, GA, in Salt Lake City, Utah. And that was huge because it showed us that our theory of change, because we're new-ish, works. That the ability for religious organizations to scale messages, to use their existing networks, to take a message and an idea, to come up with a different paradigm. Sustainable peace is a different paradigm than is normally used in climate action. And that ends up with different actions. And so now we have almost 1.2 million signatories on 5 continents, and we're still growing. And the question is, what can we do now as a network that IRAS belongs to, that PCUSA GA signed on to? What can we do as a network to find a solution to this Congo River Basin crisis? And the answer, we think, is a whole lot. And so we do think that there is this big opportunity for public awareness. We want to educate the youth especially, but the whole public about climate change. And they need to know, even in an election year, that this auction of the rainforest and the river basin could seal the fate of DRC and humanity. We have already seen the results of having such a broad network of diverse groups coming at sustainable peace in different ways. And we see it with IRAS and with PCUSA GA, in that it brings together diverse international organizations and experts to look at the problem. That's how you get to new solutions. You're looking at it from a science point of view, or a religious scholar point of view, or a biblical scholar point of view, or a peace building or humanitarian activist point of view. Rodrigue, would you like to join in?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we've been looking at is how do we engage the local communities? And we really know that by engaging local communities and leveraging in the power of religious networks that exist in the Congo and around the world, we can really drive grassroots conservation efforts, especially in DRC. And these initiatives can empower those directly affected to protect their land and the resources that they care about, but also creating sustainable community-led solutions to the Congo River Basin crisis. But also, there is another issue, which is anti-corruption. How do we think about anti-corruption measures? And we really need to advocate for anti-corruption measures, pushing specifically for public and international campaigns, demanding governmental transparency and also accountability in DRC. Our collective voice, if I can say it this way, can bring about meaningful change and protect the planet's vital ecosystem. And that goes with those two as well at the local level. Thank you.
Yeah, it is the case that when Congolese have spoken out about cobalt mining, that not much has happened. And this has not been a concern at COP. They've not ensured, well, it's been a concern, but they've not ensured that this exploitative system of modern day slavery, for instance, with tantalum in solar panels and cobalt in electric car vehicles, does not involve child labor or exploitative, what are called artisanal mines. And so it really takes other advocates, people like the members of PCUSA GA. We were so thrilled to see that as our peace pledge was up for a vote, there was also a vote going up in PCUSA GA, the Environmental Standing Committee, about Congolese mining and the crisis, the humanitarian crisis. So it takes advocates all over the world who understand, who have the education and can say we need to stop these exploitative practices. We need to rethink and revalue this paradigm of necroeconomics. We need to call for governmental transparency and accountability within DRC. However, we're trying to do all of this on September 30th at a workshop that we would like to invite all of you attendees to. Anybody who would like to come, please just contact us. I'm going to go to the next slide in a minute with our contact information. And we want lots of different organizations to not only consider joining the 1 billion for peace movement, that's 1 billion people, to make this change, to put this pressure, right, to change this lever and move it. But also, we want to do this on September 30th in a way that isn't just saying, let's stop the sale of the auction, but rather let's find equitable solutions. Part of what's driving the desperation of DRC to come up with this short-sighted plan is not only apocalyptic theology and not only, maybe greed on the part of some, and not only, lack of climate change understanding, but also the fact that they don't feel, and rightly so, that the world is looking out for them. Once again, the green technology revolution is on the backs of the Congolese. Once again, it is devaluing the bodies, the lives, and the welfare of Congolese, including Congolese children. So as part of the September 30th workshop, we are going to be inviting some of the carbon credit financing organizations to coordinate. EQX has already offered $400 million in this auction. If we can increase that, maybe they can outbid these oil companies. If we can get enough people to spread news of this and cut through the noise of the election so that everybody knows about it, then maybe we can shame the oil companies into not even wanting to be the person, or the group that buys this. There also is an opportunity to urge development of new mechanisms at the COP meetings. I hope you'll ask me about that in the Q&A. I know there's a lot to ask, but the idea that the very people who are responsible for climate change, the very nations that have profited the most, will have the kind of incentive to make radical cuts and to give freely of financing for vulnerable nations in the trillions of dollars. That's what we need to create climate resiliency for vulnerable nations that are poor, that are primarily affected, because most of the nations that will be impacted first live in the global south. So there's got to be a change in this mechanism. Like, for instance, I'm just going to say right now, whether you ask me or not, oil and gas lobbyists should not be allowed at COP. Full stop. Anyways, what we hope to have shown you is that sustainable peace is an ongoing dynamic. It is not a document that officials and decision makers come up with once only the material and the physical dimension of well-being is secured from war. That is not peace. Sustainable peace has to be deeper. It has to include ecology, and it is an ever unfolding dynamic that we have to continuously look at to say, are these needs being fulfilled? And in the case of Congo, no. So that is part of the solution. And now I'm just going to take us through some works cited. You are welcome to see these here in the video, but also we'll be happy to send it to you. And we just want to thank everybody and to once again close by saying, if you're interested in joining us September 30th, please email us at one of these emails. And that is it. We will turn it back over to the proper host who is here, and you should have that hosting capability.
And let's leave your screen sharing up for another minute or two so people can get the contact information. But we do have some questions showing up. I want to encourage everyone to post your questions in the Q&A. The chat is not active, just as a reminder. So if you have questions or comments, put them in the Q&A box. And you mentioned the September 30th workshop. And Sophia asks, aside from attending that workshop, what else can Americans do, and Americans in particular, but people in developed nations do to promote conservation and human rights in places like the DRC, given that green energy and green technology seem to be happening on the backs of people in developing nations? As both of you mentioned, the costs, human and otherwise, are huge. So what can we do to leverage our wealth and all that? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, of course, part of our answer is would you please join the 1 billion for peace movement by going to our website and signing the pledge. But that's, of course, only step one. I want to give Rodrigo a chance to answer that, but I'm going to point you to a really important book that just came out, Cobalt Red, which speaks about the suffering of this green technology that this green technology is creating. We have to have the green technology, right? We cannot make these climate goals without the green technology. We have to stop the consumption of fossil fuels, but we shouldn't be doing it once again in a form of slavery, right? And so that means that we have to find coalitions where we can all together have, 1 million voices sending a message to Congress, for instance, or to the COP leadership saying oil and gas lobbies shouldn't be there. And then the cobalt and the tantalum ought to not include child labor, but there should be, you can't also just stop paying the children, right? They're doing it for a reason, because families can't eat. So it's a complicated situation, but this is exactly the kind of mobilization that we can have all together in a much more powerful way than we can have individually, especially if, when it comes to religious organizations, if you have some group that is discounted by some decision maker, but then you have other groups, so it's an interfaith organization, it can be very powerful. It's one thing if you have maybe Muslims and then you have a Muslim lawmaker, or Jews and you have a Jewish lawmaker, Christians and you have a Christian lawmaker. But if you've got an evangelical organization and you've got a Catholic organization and a Buddhist one, and it's, et cetera, it becomes a very powerful statement if everybody together is collectively saying, we want the COP mechanism to ensure humanitarian welfare. The mines ought to be inspected. They ought to have education for the children. There ought to be safety equipment, etc. Yeah. And but first, because the most important thing that's an existential crisis, I have to say, is we have to find an equitable solution to this very pressing auction of the Congo River Basin. That is even more pressing, in my opinion. Rodrigue, did you want to add something? I don't want to take up the space.
Yeah, I think what I wanted to say is basically yes. The human environmental costs of the so-called green energy are often overlooked, right? Particularly in a place like DRC. I've been watching a documentary lately that shows the impact of cobalt exploitation in the south of Congo, in Katanga province, as we call it, or where there's a lot of activities happening, a lot of people, and the demand is really high because we all want to go green. But now the suffering, the inhumane treatment of kids, but also women in those mines is just unbelievable. Believe it or not, China has the most take in the mineral exploitation in Congo. And I think one of the way to do this is through advocacy and public pressure on companies sourcing, minerals like cobalt to adhere to not only strict human rights and environmental standards, but also, supporting policies in the supply chain, like, transparency in supply chains or ethical sourcing certifications that can promote that. But the biggest challenge is consumer awareness. What are we buying? Where is it coming from? And
Yeah.
how is that impacting people? Where it comes from is really important. If we don't know that whatever we're purchasing has some human, and devastating consequences on people, where it comes from, where it's being extracted, then we could think that everything is okay. But there's a lot of exploitation, a lot of human rights abuse, a lot of forced labor, and modern slavery, and kids, child labor, and so forth. Everything that you can think about, and that is continued to perpetuate war and violence and injustice at all levels. And corruption is a big thing because most of the big government officials make a lot of money out of this contract and this exploitation, and close their eyes and their mouth to what is happening on the ground.
Well, that's a great segue into the next question, because an anonymous person is asking, if vulnerable nations could really use an infusion of cash to help with the poverty that underlies some of these problems, how do we reconcile that with the corruption?
It's a matter of who is benefiting from the cash. So it's very clear. In fact, I have a quote here. Let me read this quote if I can find it very quickly from the Minister of Hydrocarbons. Didier Boudimbu gave an interview in which he said very clearly that DRC is open to carbon financing, right? And the carbon credit financing scheme of EQX and some others would then pay Congo to conserve the rainforest, for instance, but then also pour money into green projects that would employ people in Congo and improve life within Congo. However, he's also made it clear that it's not about carbon credit financing for them. It is about money. So this is the quote. He said in an interview to the Financial Times, quote, "We're not doing this to destroy the rainforest. We're doing it for economic gain. With or without oil, what's important is that we earn money." But again, the question is, where is the money going? So the problem with corruption is that just a few people, some mine owners, and many of them are foreign companies outside of Congo. And so the mine owners that are mostly in China, the oil companies that are bidding on this land, which will displace, up to 150 ethnic groups and threaten water for 75 million people, et cetera, reduce rain from the Horn of Africa to the Sahel, as I said earlier, you know, who then is getting rich from it? Not those people. And so equity has to be part of the solutions, and there has to be a multi-pronged solution. So as Rodrigue was saying, you know, where's the cobalt going? It's going to the car manufacturers for their electric car vehicles, right? Where is tantalum going? It's to the solar panel companies. Where are the mines right now going, but to Apple? So we can have a consumer outcry to Apple saying we want safety certification. We want there to be an end to child labor practices, which is why our theory of change so heavily relies on public education. I don't think that most people know this. I don't think that they know that as we're on our laptops right now, we're using minerals mined by little children in Congo, but it's probably the case. About a third of the cobalt comes from these mines. So it's a matter of public education. Did you want to add something?
Yeah,
Rodrigue?
I mean, when it comes to corruption, I think the most effective way to combat corruption and promote development at the local level really is to focus on strengthening institutions. So increasing transparency. I watch Congolese news every day, and every single day you will hear that millions of dollars has been taken by one or another official in the Congo and disappeared. No justice, no accountability, and nothing. So sometimes we can even, have funding to support these local communities, but if there's no transparency, there's no accountability. This money will not go to the right people. They will still be lost in the pockets of people that are not the final destination. So I think let's say governments or institutions or international bodies should really require independent audits. Every time that money is sent to the Congo, we need to know really who is accessing that money, how the money has been used, but also making sure that the local communities engage in the process so that we can, help them benefit from these resources. And sometimes it's just, I feel like it gets to a point where they appoint the wrong people at the wrong place to manage big projects, and Congo is one of those examples. Like the person that Francis was mentioning, former minister of the hydrocarbon, I don't know.
Yeah, hydrocarbons, yes.
Hydrocarbon. He has
Oil.
no idea or education whatsoever in that field. So it's someone that just found himself appointed, and so the skills are not there, but they're appointed based on political party and affiliation and friendship with the president or being close to the first lady, and so that's how it goes. And people are appointed every single day, just like that. Now, a big project like this comes to the hands of the wrong people. Not only do they not know what the consequences are, even when they know that, I think that their brain doesn't process the consequences compared to the amount of money that they can really amass in that small amount of time. And so that's been a challenge.
Rodrigue, I know that the environment minister, Eve, but is it Baziba?
Bazaiba.
Baziba. I'm not saying her name correctly. That she has been trying to advocate for conservation of the Congo River basin, going French, English. She has a background, in which she understands some of the consequences, but there is some lack of understanding of climate change. I would say, not only among officials in DRC, but sometimes officials in the United States as well, right? One of the things that I would say is that as US-based nonprofit, the US has a tremendous role to play here. If we are the greatest historical emitter of CO2 and still have the greatest per capita emissions, right? And yet we produced more oil in 2023 than any other world country, then we ought to be tying our greenhouse gas emissions to all the numbers of refugees and immigrants that this is going to create. We ought to be financing the trillions of dollars of climate disaster relief that's needed by vulnerable nations, but we're not. We, in fact, held up the last negotiations because after finally creating it's called a loss and damage fund, which is, just think of it as a bucket. It's just an empty bucket that we created this fund. The US would not agree to commit nations to contribute to the fund. We said that the contributions had to be voluntary. And if I'm not mistaken, we ended up giving, I'm going to say $11 million. Anyways, it's very little compared to the trillions that's needed, And, when you consider how much money we're putting into subsidizing the oil and gas industry in the United States, it's nothing.
Francis, I think you could stop screen sharing now, and then people will be able to see your faces a little bigger.
Okay.
And Penny is asking if you would show us again who the author of Cobalt Red is.
Yes. It is Siddharth Kara.
So people can screenshot that or write it down.
And it's a really tough but important read.
Paul Collins is asking if you have tried to work with or affiliate with some of the big environmental organizations like Environmental Defense Fund, 350, Sierra Club, Greenpeace, Union of Concerned Scientists, American Scientific Affiliation, and so on. Any traction there?
I will tell you that we discovered this situation about the Congo auction, which has barely been covered by the news, did about 2 weeks of a very deep dive of research to make sure we were understanding the situation, verified it with some of the science and some of the journalism and the coverage, because not much is, many people in Congo don't even know this is going on. And Rodrigue could speak to that. But we had to really do a deep dive for a few weeks, and because we were so stunned that this was happening. And so all of this is extremely new. So I've literally at this point sent out a handful of invitations, including to some of the organizations you were just speaking about. And I really hope that they come to the September workshop. Again, we're not trying to lead it. We're just trying to coordinate everyone. So then in October, November, and December, while the auction is going on, the news gets out, because we've got to break through the election noise, which is big, very big in the United States, and big for climate as well. And so it's a really difficult thing. And so we just want to coordinate. We want to say, what is your group doing? What is your group doing? Do you know about this? And what we can do is to furnish some of this resource research, right? So everybody isn't starting from scratch, so they don't lose that 3 weeks, right? And that's why we have such a detailed PowerPoint.
When are the auctions happening?
Through 2024. Now it started in 2023, and then it was put on hold, and then it started again. But we may have as little as 3 months. And what's significant about this, it was Rodrigue who alerted me to this Invest in Congo sort of conference being held in New York City during September, and looking at the list of all the people that are invited and going to come to the Invest in Congo conference, which is hosted by a subsidiary branch of the United Nations, again, includes a lot of oil and gas lobbyists. And so this message isn't getting out, and this is all happening very quickly under our noses. But again, affects all of humanity.
So there isn't.
I believe I'm saying those words, but
it's not like the auction is happening on November 17th or something. They're sort of auctioning the parcels over time, or?
No, it's happening now. The auction's open. So they're taking bids. So they've received multiple bids. It's in our PowerPoint from foreign companies oil companies. I think there are 2 Congolese oil companies, which actually just only slightly improves the situation, but is still devastating for, the planet. And so they've collected bids, and they've also collected this one bid from EQX for carbon climate financing. It's difficult for us to get more information on that, and that's another reason to bring everybody together. But that's the idea.
An anonymous attendee asks, and I'm just going to read this.
Mhm.
How would one respond to the comment that green technology at all costs, purportedly to slow down global warming, seems bound to cause more damage both to the environment and to the climate as now in this auction, and human rights? How can the buying power of green energy consumers be more leveraged in specific ways?
Rodrigo, would you like to respond first, or?
Yeah, I can go ahead. And what I would say is really, so green technology, if it's pursued at all costs, right, can indeed create significant environmental and humanitarian issues. As we've been seeing and heard from the DRC's auction. So I think the key is responsible sourcing and ethical supply chain. I said that earlier, because consumers can use their buying power by demanding certified products that ensure that, ethical mining practices, similar to, fair trade or conflict-free certification, things like that, that could help. But also public pressure on companies and governments can push for, stricter regulations on resource exploitation. And this really, what it does is that it ensures that environmental sustainability and human rights are also prioritized over profit. Because overall, most of what is happening is about profit. And now how do we as consumers who end up buying these products can say, hey, we don't want things that are harming people or the environment. We want to buy products that are certified, that are clean, that also upholds people's rights and dignity. And that, I think that's one of the ways that we can make sure that we're not just moving to green technology and then, letting everything explode. Yeah.
I think this was actually part of the implicit agenda of the IRAS conference on Star Island, not this last summer, but the summer before. And you were there, JD, presenting, and so was I. In that, will things get so bad that to survive, to even have a human species, will resort to something like solar radiation management and blocking out the sun, which is going to cause the death of almost everybody on the planet. Well, this is Plan B that's being discussed in some circles, including it's made it into the Secretary General of the UN's report. It's made it into, governmental officials' reports. But why is this happening? Part of the problem, I think, is that the public really doesn't have enough climate change education or understand the things that we're talking about. The IPCC reports are wonderful, but they are very difficult to understand for anyone who doesn't have a scientific background. Part of what I've spent my time in BioEarth doing is translating it for the public, but we need a lot more people to be doing that. And I think that climate change education is so important, because if we all really understood where we were, that we have 5 years to do this, 5 years to cut our global emissions in half, we would understand more the reasons for this collective, I'm going to use the word sacrifice. There's going to be a change. Americans cannot continue to live the lifestyles that we've been living, because we are ending our own future and everyone else's future. But because the impacts don't hit us first, because we have not had good climate change education on a public basis, widespread, and we don't understand it. We've had poor science education, period. And not to mention,
Just buy more air conditioners, right?
yeah, not to mention biblical illiteracy You know, we've had Senator Jim Inhofe stand in Congress holding a snowball, saying there's no such thing as climate change because I'm holding a snowball. Like he didn't understand, you know, the basics of sixth grade, you know, climate change education. But he also, in my opinion, had some bad theology and couldn't read the biblical text that he was using as proof. So it is a multi-pronged solution. That's why I think the 1 billion for peace pledge to me and the 1 billion for peace movement offers hope. I don't think there's any organization that feels like it can fix this problem on its own. This problem is so wicked, to use the scientific language. It's so complicated. You have to bring in people from every sector, every continent, you know, every religion, every secular organization, all throughout civil societies. But we can demand that there be more equity in these climate solutions. But if we don't, then we're going to have, you know, a future that is so harrowing, we can't imagine it, in which we're blocking out the sun. And I mean, speaking for myself, I don't know who on here is a billionaire, but speaking for myself, I won't be in the group that is, you know, rescued anyways. Like most of humanity won't be. So the numbers that we're looking at now, you know, on our present pathway, unless we change our course, we're headed for twice our goal, 3.2 to 4 degrees Celsius. Celsius, multiply that times 1.8 for Fahrenheit. It's a lot. So that's twice in Congo. Most people are unaware that we're looking at mass migration within 25 years. We're living in this kind of illusory world in which we don't want to be inconvenienced, in which we're playing into short political cycles that have selfish messages for the purpose of getting elected. Broad-based, really thorough climate change education across the entire world would change a lot of this, in my opinion. So would changing the mechanisms at COP, because we're all relying on COP to fix everything. And some of the mechanisms are really broken. I'm going to say one last thing, I see the time, but there are no enforcement mechanisms.
Right.
That's one of the biggest problems. So what we're relying on are the very
The
nation
goodwill of nations like China and Russia and the United States.
and the US that have tied our economics and our political cycles to the convenience of, you know, the electorate without climate change education. And then somehow we're expecting that we're going to do this radical transformation, right? And we're going to do it voluntarily with promises called NDCs, when there is zero accountability if we don't make the promised emission target. Zero. That's not a very, I mean, I'm an optimist. I try to be a realist and an optimist. That's just not a very, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. If we don't prioritize the voices of the people that are on the front lines of climate change at COP, nothing's going to change. And if we don't have public understanding of what goes on behind the curtain at COP, nothing's going to change.
I'm going to give Jim Miller the last question, and then when you've answered that, I'll let Maynard come back on to take us out. Jim asks, is part of the challenge the varying time perspectives? So, for example, economic profit and loss happens on a quarterly basis for the most part. Weather effects unfold over years, climate disasters potentially over generations. So he asks, how do we learn to feel the future so as to motivate present action?
I mean, leave it to Jim Miller. It's always an insightful question. It's such a difficult question. Again, I'm not thinking I have simple answers for these things, but one of the things that I can say is that when the leading institutions that we're dependent upon to make these decisions have only looked at the problem and not the root of the paradigm that is driving the system that created climate change in the first place, we may very well create another green technology revolution, et cetera, with the same inherent inequity and problems as before. However, when we look to indigenous nations, it's a problematic category, but indigenous nations or First Nations or Aboriginal peoples or each group wants to be called something different. But the 5,000 different groups that are just lumped under indigenous by most scholars, right? That they make up just 5% of the world's population. But right now, they manage the least desirable lands, which is why they've been allowed to have them, that nobody else wants. And yet, on those least desirable lands, they are in charge now of 80% of the Earth's remaining biodiversity. So part of this involves a deep understanding that we have to look at the religious underpinnings, the cultural underpinnings, our assumptions, our blind spots. As I'm going to say it as somebody who was raised, in a developed nation, in a highly developed nation. And we have to ask those things. We have to change our educational system to prepare us for the future we're actually going to have. And we need to be rethinking a lot of the paradigms and the assumptions that we had. And that includes time. And that includes whether this can only be solved with a political process and economic process. I don't think capitalism is the root of all evil, unlike some people. But I think that the paradigm that devalues Congolese bodies and lives and welfare, when fused with capitalism, is pretty evil. So we need some new thinking. And that's the job of theologians. And that's why I love IRAS, because you take science and you take religion and this interdisciplinary perspective. Rodrigue, would you like the last word before they close us out?
Yeah, I think what I was going to say is that the biggest thing is to really build a mindset that looks ahead, helping people and leaders think about how what we do today, affects future generations. Because it might be a very easy thing to just say, hey, this is not happening now. We don't need to do anything, but we can really think about what we do today. How does it affect the future, and how can we either encourage or cheer for policies or folks that really think about the future, setting up an example for ethical investment or policy that protect just human rights, the environment, but also the communities of the future. Most of the time I say those that are not at the decision-making table are victims of the decisions. And the future generation, for instance, in terms of climate change, most likely a lot of future generation will be sacrificed by the policies that we're doing that if we don't enforce ethical, mining practices or, climate change education and actions.
Youth.
Yeah.
Youth. Yep. That's why I love your organization, Vijana Africa, Youth of Africa. That's who.
Yeah. They have to be a part of the decision, but also be equipped enough, not just be looked at as an example of things that we do and say, hey, well, you see, the young people are here too. They need to be equipped, empowered, and heard. The voices are very important.
And they are invited to our September 30th Key Action Mobilization Workshop. Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
We're going to have to end there.